Standing in for Asian youth, Myni and Abi have come together in conversation to try and make sense of, reflect on, and make the most of life.
Just listen to your introduction, and it ends up talking about how, as your parents started to drift apart, it suddenly woke you up to think about what was going on in life. That must have been extraordinary for you. Do you think back to your parents and your grandparents? Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about, well, we'll go the oldest the first, shall we?
Okay. So if we start with my dad's side of the family, his mother, my grandma Enid, she was a full-time mother and also, I suppose, a part-time carer. Back when my dad was brought into the world, she met her husband back when they were quite young, and because of the war, they never actually married because it wasn't safe to do so until after the war. They were very much a working family. You worked, lived, and so forth. They had 5 children, very big family, and it was always their ethics of, right, you guys, you are now of age, you go out, you get jobs, and you carry on with your life, really. Compared to my mum's mum, her and my granddad struggled to have children, and they actually adopted my mum after they tried to have children. And my granddad was very much a worker. My grandma worked as well. She was a hairdresser, but she was always around to look after my mum and their second child that they had, my uncle. But they were always around, and they always had a lot more than what my dad kind of grew up in. What about you? Do you remember your grandparents?
Well, in part, but I was just going to go back to you a minute. You knew all of your grandparents, didn't you? Your grandmothers and grandfathers on both sides.
I knew. I knew my mum's parents. My granddad passed away in 2002, but my grandma only passed away about 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. My grandma actually lived until she was 102. But I didn't ever know my dad's dad. And I wouldn't say that I was particularly close to my dad's mum either, just because of location-wise. She was up in Kent whilst we were down here, and we were brought up down here and things like that. So we'd only see her very, very rarely. Whereas my mum's mum and dad, my grandma and granddad, they were nearby. They were only 20 minutes drive away from our family house, so therefore they were much more around than what my dad's mum was. And because of my dad and his work and things like that, my gran did take care of me and my brother quite a lot as well. So she was almost like a second parent to me, in a way.
Yeah. Well, I never knew either of my grandfathers, so I only had like the grandmothers to go on. And I think on my father's side, he didn't have a good relationship. He adored his father and hated his mother. And so by the time I arrived on the scene, his mother was living down in Hove in Sussex, and they used to take me down once a year to parade me. And I wasn't really aware of anything. It was a lovely party, and my father's brother used to come, and his son, my cousin. And so once a year we'd have a marvellous party. But my father always made it quite clear that he didn't think much of his mother, really. And I'm not really sure what happened there, because I think she was left in quite reduced circumstances, because he then... they actually got divorced, and I'm not sure if they got divorced perhaps because there was, as well as my father and his brother, there was a younger sister. But she only made it to about the age of 7, and she died of peritonitis. And I don't know whether perhaps that caused the marriage to split. We're never going to know. Or whether my grandfather was up to no good and he'd found another woman. And so he left my grandmother, and she was left in reduced circumstances. So I just don't know. But maybe that paved the way to all sorts of troubles in the future as far as my father was concerned. Because while my grandfather was alive, he spent every minute with him that he could.
It's interesting that you say that you're not sure what happened with the marriage there.
Yeah.
I mean, I know when I grew up, and when I would always go over and see my gran, quite literally my gran and granddad lived in 2 bungalows, semi-detached.
Yes.
And I always remember going to see my gran first in one half of the bungalow, literally walking around the path from the front door, going through a gate, and then into my granddad's on his side of the bungalow. So...
Did you ever question it? Or it was just as it was?
It was always as it was. I mean, we're probably talking, I was probably about 5 or 6 at this stage, so I didn't know any different. And I just thought it was the norm for when, I don't know, when your grandparents, when they get older, they just live next door to each other.
Yes. Yeah.
But obviously something, now that I'm older, now I understand a bit more, I've realised that there was a reason why they were living separate, and they had a massive argument, and they did lead separate lives because of various arguments that, funny enough, my dad actually remembers one when he was... when he actually came to stay one weekend. My granddad stormed out and he was gone for about 3-4 days, which was interesting.
Yes. Well, by the time I arrived on the scene, as far as my father was concerned, he was living in Dulwich with his new wife and their daughter. So I just never questioned anything at all. We shared a big old house, and we had like the ground floor, and my grandmother had all the rest, and her daughter. And of course, I never met my grandfather; he was gone by that time. And as far as so, there were all sorts of. I only discovered the skeletons in the cupboard later on, and with my mother, I think that again, I never knew my grandfather. But what I did learn, and my grandmother on my mother's side lived in a rental flat in London, and again, you don't question how people live at all at that time. But I found out eventually that there had been another child, my uncle, who I never met, who died in a skiing accident, and I think it broke the family. And I don't really know what happened, but I think my grandfather died a couple of years after that, and I think the money ran out, and my mother, who was, they were all into education and universities, she wasn't able to continue her path into education, and she had to go out and earn a living, and I think it sort of broke the family. And I don't know, I mean, I just, by the time I arrived, and I never really had any interest in what happened to my parents at all. I don't know why. I feel bad about it now at the age that I am, but I just didn't question anything. But I guess there were all sorts of skeletons in different cupboards. which maybe we'll find more out about later.
I think that's. I think it's something you never do question when you're of that age. You never do question why did my granddad live separately to my grandma? You just you trust your parents, and you trust that if there's an issue, they will do their best to explain to you in such a way that you understand it. If they don't explain to you, you just, I don't know, you just assume that it's the norm. But it's not, I suppose it's not until you get older when you start understanding, okay, the sky is blue because of, that you understand why your parents or grandparents did separate, and and any potential reasons as to why. And it's not until you get older that you start understanding more about relationships and why things are, that you do start to question things.
I don't know what to think about all of this. I don't know. I mean, obviously you're much, much younger than I am. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose awareness grows gradually. But it's one of the things that I come to think are really important, is that you kind of find out sort of what's happened in your family. And at some point, I don't know, take an interest instead of being so, we're all sort of so absorbed in ourselves. We never, and I do, and I know you think, because we've talked about it before, that you think children should be children. But I do think maybe sooner rather than later, kids need to find out what's happened to their parents and have some empathy for that, really, which is what we're talking now, really, aren't we? Yeah.
And I think, I was probably about, 5 and 6 and just thought that it was the norm that my grandparents lived separately.
Yeah.
I suppose it wasn't until I was a bit older, when my parents then separated, it was then I started to think about, okay, well, my parents were separated because they didn't get on for various reasons. What was the reason between my grandparents splitting up? Because I wasn't there at the time when they did leave separate lives. I was brought into the world that they already had led separate lives. But I do think it's important, because I feel that there is a similarity between definitely my mum's parents and how my parents led separate lives. There's almost a link between how my grandparents separated to my parents.
How old were you when you found out the truth about the situation with your mother?
With my mother? About about when they separated, you mean? Or
well, when she discovered the truth about her adopted father.
It wasn't until my granddad passed away in 2002. So my mum would have been 48, late 40s.
And how old were you?
She found out. I was 8. Oh, she might have been a bit younger, actually.
Did that have any impact on you at all? Perhaps you should explain, if you don't mind.
I mean, I was only 8, so again, I still didn't really question anything. Looking back on it, I suppose my parents became a bit more open about what is, why things are how they are. And I suppose they explained a bit more about, feelings. And I suppose it's not until you start talking about your feelings as to when, things start coming up. I still didn't really... I felt quite sad that my mum didn't know.
Yes.
However, what a shame that my grandma knew and didn't tell my mum.
I think parents often make lots of perhaps sometimes with hindsight, weird decisions about things.
Yeah.
I don't know what I think about that. I definitely don't think kids need to know everything all of the time. I think there is a time and a place for them to learn about things, but everything's unique and individual and different, so you can't make sweeping statements about that sort of thing, really, can
and
you?
I don't think it's been until fairly recently, I mean, we're talking within the last couple of years, that my mum has really opened up about it. I think she's almost just put it to bed and tried not to revisit it.
I mean, it must have been a mega adjustment for her.
Absolutely.
I can't begin to understand how that must have got her, really.
No. What a shame, though. What a shame.
Well, it is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that was really interesting. It's really made me think about what my grandparents had to go through.
Me too. You don't often get the chance to reflect so far back. Much food for thought, I think.
Absolutely.